Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
Keeping financial reporting honest is critical, but for smaller public companies, meeting Sarbanes-Oxley requirements can be a costly challenge. A new GAO report finds that while compliance boosts transparency, the burden of auditor fees and internal controls hits small firms harder, raising questions about how to strike the right balance. Here to fill us in on their findings is Director, Financial Markets and Community Investments at GAO, Michael Clements. Mr. Clements, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Terry.
I want to ask first if you can refresh our collective memory on Sarbanes-Oxley. It's a law that was passed back in 2002, but what was the problem it was trying to solve and what provisions did it set up?
That's right, Terry. In 2002, Congress passed the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. The overall intent was to improve the reliability of both financial reporting and auditing. And the impetus for this act was some scandals in accounting and financial reporting. Listeners might have heard of Enron and WorldCom. So inappropriate financial reporting, fraud type of activities. And what Congress wanted to do was get ahead of that and improve financial reporting and improve auditing.
So you just did a fresh look at how that was playing out. What did you find? What was the big problem that you were looking at?
That's right. We looked at one particular element of Sarbanes-Oxley, which is Section 404. And this really concerns internal controls over financial reporting. What policies and procedures do firms have in place to ensure that they are reporting reliable financial statistics? Congress's concern is that Section 404, in particular one part of it, Section 404B, which is known as the auditor attestation, can impose cost on firms. And these costs can be particularly burdensome for smaller firms. And there's an overall concern among Congress about declining number of public companies, declining number of IPOs, and so how do we rectify that? And so this is one area of a cost for firms trying to go public that Congress wanted us to look at.
And there's a barrier here about exempt and non-exempt firms. Can you help us understand that?
That's correct. So again, we're talking about Section 404B and this idea of an auditor attestation. So what happens is management is required to set up and monitor and report on its internal controls. Certain firms then are required to have an external auditor essentially review and attest to those internal controls. Pretty early on, the Securities and Exchange Commission realized this was going to be burdensome for smaller firms, so it exempted smaller firms from this requirement. In 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act codified that, said any firm with what's known as public float, that you can think of shares that are outstanding, market value of those shares outstanding would be exempt. In 2012, Congress also came back with the Jobs Act and said we're going to create what's known as an emerging growth company, a firm which has revenues less than today, it's around $1.2 billion. These firms are exempt from that requirement. So we set up this environment where we have some firms that are exempt and then larger firms that are non-exempt. Again, with the intent of trying to lessen some of these burdens among the smaller firms.
But the reason we have the internal controls and the attestations is because this kind of information moves markets, right? So it's important that it's correct.
That's correct. Our securities markets are really driven by a disclosure regime. Investors are free, within reason, to take as much or as little risk as they want, but in return, what they should receive are reliable and material financial reporting so that they can make an informed judgment. And that's why these internal controls can be important to ensure that the numbers that people are making investment decisions on are reliable.
Well, with all of that as background, then once you began the assessment, what did you find?
Well, the first thing we found is what might be expected, which is that auditor attestation does involve a significant cost increase for firms. It's hard to really measure this because audit costs are often integrated, right? So the analysis of the internal controls, analysis of the financial statements, the auditor does it all at one time. And in fact, it's required to do that. So it's a little tough to suss out exactly what the costs are. But what we did is took a sample of approximately 100 firms that were exempt and then went to non-exempt and said, how did their audit costs change? And what we found was in that year of transition for firms, so again, firms going essentially exempt, being smaller, to non-exempt, its costs went up by about $219,000 or a 13% increase. Not only that, we also found that the cost went up about $80,000 the year before that. And what we had learned during this work is that firms will realize we're about to become non-exempt. We need to start getting some practice in this, involving auditors. So that would be another reason why those costs go up. These costs, and this is not a one-time cost, right? The costs go up, and then the firm has that higher level of cost consistently thereafter. And what we found on a longer-term basis, doing some econometrics, that these costs are about 19% higher for the non-exempt firms than they are for the exempt firms.
I'm speaking with Michael Clements. He's a director in the Financial Markets and Community Investment Division at GAO. If firms know that they're going to face these higher auditing costs, is that a disincentive to grow? Is that a concern here?
I don't think it's a disincentive, but what it could be is a disincentive necessarily to go become a public company. These rules apply to public companies. And again, that gets back to Congress's concern about disincentives for firms to list their shares and move forward in that direction.
So as you went through your findings, what recommendations do you have, and who do you direct the recommendations to in this case?
In this case, we didn't have recommendations, right? Congress was more interested in understanding what these costs were looking like, and then also what the implications were of these. For example, what are the implications for firms? So one of the things we found was that firms have reported that if they were not subject to these auditor attestations, they could then roll some of the costs, the time that's involved for staff, other resources in business development, such as research and development. On the flip side, right, we've talked about the importance of accurate financial statements. If the firm is exempt, what we've also noticed that these firms would have what's known as a higher cost of capital. In other words, it costs more money for the firms to raise their capital to provide these services. And the reason is that investors will expect a slightly higher return because there's a perception of a little greater risk. And so the firm at that point is balancing these two issues off of higher cost of capital along with higher audit fees.
Do you find that firms, or did you find that firms that didn't have to do the attestation might have slacked up a little bit on the internal controls piece?
Yeah, the results are a little mixed on terms of quality and the reliability of financial reporting. SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, did a study several years ago looking at these exempt and non-exempt. And the question was, how many times did firms need to restate their financial results? So if a firm puts out financial statements and there's a material error, they need to restate them. What the SEC study found is both exempt and non-exempt are fairly similar, around 2.5% of companies required to restate. That said, the emerging growth companies, which the Job Act created, were a little higher at 4%. We conducted a similar restatement analysis. What we found was that the exempt firms were more likely to report that weak internal controls were the contributing factor to their restatement of their financial results.
And so how is the SEC or other sort of market stakeholders reacting to your report?
At this time, Congress is taking a look at it. The Subcommittee on Capital Markets held a recent hearing looking at these issues, and we'll see where Congress goes in terms of making a decision on that.
What do you think might happen?
I can't predict at this point.
No crystal ball for market prediction?
Not at this point.
What potential might there be for changing the rules so that they are less burdensome on small business?
What Congress has been considering is raising those limits. Right, making more companies exempt would be the approach to go.
I've been speaking with Michael Clements. He's the Director of Financial Markets and Community Investment Division at GAO. Thank you so much for sharing this report with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We'll post this interview along with a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, Welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down and work hard, et cetera. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, et cetera, even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences, and that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career, perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge, and how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that, like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing, around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction. But of course, it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it. Share the credit. Perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has pearls of wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.